Okay. Um, okay. Thanks. That was great, Laszlo. And that was actually a nice connection between stuff that was going on at the end of yesterday and some stuff, a little bit of what I'll talk about in the panel. We have a large panel, obviously. So we're each going to try to take about 10 minutes, including me. That's very optimistic, I know. And to leave time for questions for any of us or all of us, at the end of that. So mine's going to be quite short. And I wanted to start, I think everybody here has heard, the quote, or at least a piece of the quote from Hawking about, I think the next century will be the century of complexity. That's the century we're in now. But looking at the whole quote is kind of interesting. He goes on to say, we have already discovered the basic laws that govern matter and understand all the normal situations. We don't know how the laws fit together and what happens under extreme conditions. I expect we'll find a complete unified theory, blah, blah, blah. There's no limit to the complexity that we can build using these basic laws. There's actually some problems with this. The first part, it's like, oh yeah, Hawking's into complexity, but really it's a very physics-based view of complexity. That becomes very apparent when you look at the whole quote. And I think he's wrong. There actually is a limit to complexity, that the laws of physics themselves, you can build with them. And I think a lot of that's come out in some of the talks and discussions that we've had about, what theory and generality and universality are in adaptive systems. So, he clearly was coming out of, the perspective that universality has been found in many aspects of physical systems, but of course, much less so in adaptive systems. And my thoughts on complex systems, just to be really explicit about some basic things that have been floating around here and elsewhere. The way I and many of us think about complex systems is that there's two fundamental currencies and one fundamental dynamic. The two currencies are energy, which is interconvertible with resources. The other currency, of course, is information, and then the fundamental dynamic is adaptation, selection. And so any comprehensive or general theory of complexity, or theories, sub-theories of complexity, will necessarily bring together these concepts, adaptation and selection, with thermodynamics and information theory. Another way of saying this is how is information accumulated, stored, and utilized at many scales under adaptive dynamics, and what are the associated energy requirements? And I think, a lot of us, our work tends to fall more on the energy and resources side or on the information side. Ultimately, what we need to do is to be bringing those things together. I don't bring those things together yet, but many of us think about ways in which to bring these things together, and some work does it better than others. And these were just some random, or not totally random, but thoughts about some of the things that have been said here and elsewhere. Many, but not all, aspects of complex systems are contingent. And the identification of regularities is often, but certainly not always, the first step in development of quantitative predictive theory for universal features of complex systems. You can start with models. You can start with theory. I think we've seen examples already of, kind of an empirically based approach versus a more modeling or theory-based approach. They obviously all have to come together at some point. Regularities emerge at some coarse-grained scales, but not others. And regularities emerge as a result of various thermodynamic and information processing constraints or opportunities or system-driven coarse grainings. So we've heard, about, kind of issues around stability enhancement of complex systems or increased efficiency or uncertainty reduction. I think there's a variety of kind of possible constraints and opportunities that people are thinking about. And also, trade-offs are often at play across these kinds of constraints and also across scales and between contingency and convergence. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And the actual is often a subset of the possible. So while it's good to look at the actual, thinking about the possible landscape is often extremely useful. So now I'll go into what I do, just for 5 minutes. And actually, this isn't even so much what I do right now, but it's just an illustration of empirical regularity. So I study ecological networks. I've done a lot of work on food webs. Laszlo mentioned food webs. They were a couple data points in a couple of his slides. These are just images of some food webs where the nodes are species and the directed links between them are feeding interactions, from a variety of different systems. And, ecologists would tend to look at this and be like, oh, there's a lot of complexity across these habitats. The food webs should all be quite different from each other. So I call that apparent complexity. This isn't a slide you're meant to be able to see the details of. This is a very old figure from basically my first food web paper a million years ago. It shows the cumulative distributions, link distributions of each little box as a particular food web. And these are on a log linear scale, so a straight line is approximately exponential. And this is basically just showing, it's cumulative. So to the left, you see like 100% of taxa within each of the food webs has one or more feeding links. And then the most generalized species is the point to the right. And, one thing just to glance at is like these degree distributions all look pretty darn different. They're different shapes, different, and, people have kind of looked at stuff like this and said, oh, yeah, see, food webs are different. And this is, of course, degree distribution is a very minimal way of thinking about network structure, but kind of useful and important in some cases. And we just saw an interesting example of the relationship between controllability and degree distribution. This is not one of those food webs. This is a food web that was published after that initial paper. But this food web for a marine system was basically at the center of a paper by someone else that basically claimed that marine food webs were really different from other kinds of food webs. And a lot of claims like that. And I still see claims like that. And just to show a degree distribution in a more raw way, how many prey. So it's basically, this is just the histogram of how many predators have X number of prey species. Most things are specialists. A few things are generalists or hypergeneralists out in the tail. And this is another way of showing the same data. Again, a cumulative distribution, this time on a log-log graph. But this time it's been normalized. So as opposed to what we saw in these are unnormalized. And it's just been normalized very simply in terms of the numbers of links and species within the food web. So again, basically 100% of consumers feed on one or more resources, and then the most general consumer is out there in the tail. But what we can do then is we can normalize other data sets and just drop them on top of each other, and you get this really nice scale collapse. And this is just kind of a subsample of available data sets across a variety of different marine, aquatic, and terrestrial food webs. So all of a sudden, you've gone from like, oh my gosh, there's this bewildering diversity and complexity of, how ecological networks are organized to, there's this apparently universal-ish, general-ish kind of distribution popping out. And then you can play games like, well, let's go find some other data, or let's put other data together, because, I have colleagues who focus on parasites. Parasites are a huge part of the diversity of any ecosystem. And the parasitologists got really excited about food web work. And one of the reasons they got excited was because they're like, oh, we're going to upend everything you know about food webs when we throw parasites in. And I was like, well, that's a hypothesis. Let's check it out. And so there was an ongoing working group at NCEIF that was working on the structure and dynamics of parasites in ecological networks, put together a bunch of really awesome data. This shows the difference between a food web where you don't include the parasites and one where you do for an estuary. But we can drop these onto, the same kind of, once we normalize the data for the size of the networks, they're falling on the same curve, the intertidal with and without parasites. And this is just, again, these are samples of many other data sets we have. And you can go back through deep time and through work with Doug Irwin from quite a while ago now and from his colleague Conrad Labandera at the Smithsonian, put together some really cool food web data for very ancient ecosystems, including the Burgess Shale and the Changsheng Shale, and then the more recent Messel Shale. And you can ask the very simple question: are these organized fundamentally differently or similarly to modern systems and to each other? You drop those on, and again, you see once you normalize the data, and you see this general pattern popping out, which in terms of degree distribution, but it's basically indicating there's a balance of generalists and specialists across these systems and across time, different habitats and different types of taxa. So that's cool. And I'm actually almost done. I mean, I've gotten really interested in kind of this pattern-seeking part of the process. And all this is very small data. In an era of big data, I play with small, bad data, but it's really fun. And I like to work with people to put new kinds of data together. And there's many other kinds of regularities that we see across ecological networks, both food webs and other kinds of ecological networks, but that's a much longer conversation. But okay, you have a regularity, you think, what do? You can poke at it. Is there actually a there? What are the biases? How much is what you're seeing driven by sampling bias or other kinds of incompleteness? You can coarse grain it, you can unpack it. Extend it, which is some of what I just showed you very quickly. How general is it? You can model it, express or investigate it quantitatively, which has been done. It also invites you to look at related regularities. Like in this case, is there systematic variation around the central tendency? And what does that tell you about what's going on? That's often even more interesting than the original central tendency. And I think we may hear a little bit about some of that in the scale panel that follows. And then explore and answer the why questions, which is, of course, what we're all interested in. And part of that, of course, is developing predictive theory and testing it. And finding out, suggesting new data to go out and compile or collect. And I mean, all of this is, to me, what's so exciting about trying to look for and understand universal patterns in adaptive systems. And we've already heard a variety of really interesting approaches and ways that people are thinking about that in a huge variety of systems. And that's pretty much it. I just wanted to point out a couple of papers that different subsets of people in this room have been involved with on theory in adaptive systems. David led a paper in 2011 on the challenges and scope of theoretical biology that several people here are co-authors on. And I mean, kind of a very unexciting title, but, of course, is addressing a lot of these. I mean, a strangely unexciting title for David Krakauer. But talking about how do we achieve and what are aspects of general theory and biology, and more recently in 2014, many people on this panel and a couple people who are in the audience and were actually on the other paper published something in Bioscience called On Theory and Ecology, which talks about the apparent theory richness of ecology that's actually not nearly as rich as people would claim because of the way that various people use the term theory. But then, kind of laying out an argument for the importance and the nature of kind of quantitative predictive efficient theory in ecology. And also laying the groundwork for some ongoing efforts to integrate theory and ecology, first principles theory, to come up with more universal, more general sorts of frameworks for understanding ecological patterns and processes. And I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to actually call Mercedes up next because I have her slides already. Nope, you get to be second. And yeah, sorry that I don't have the totally updated version, but yeah, absolutely.
And so that sort of invariant distribution spectrum of generalist specialists, is it your belief that primarily driven by
Yeah, so in relation to that distribution, universal distribution of generalists and specialists, do you think it's primarily driven by a sort of an energy allocation theory that says this is how energy has to be allocated into biomass in a certain way, or is it a kind of robustness argument?
Probably yeah, there it is. I think we don't know, so that is actually an open question. I mean, there's a Maxent sort of fit between, the exponential-ish type of distribution we're seeing, but in terms of, I think it's probably got to do, there's probably a thermodynamic constraint, that relates to resource allocation across, and going up trophic levels. I think there's probably also a stability, robustness component. I mean, there have been explorations around the edges. There isn't a really good kind of theoretical framework for that yet, so.